Over the course of this channel's lifespan, I've gotten several comments on one specific franchise that I just refused to cover for like a singular reason. Because a better, more clear version was dropping in just a few years, and I resolved that if my channel was still around by then, and by the time it actually came out, I would come back and hit it hard, and that time is finally upon us. I don't think you really understand what this game means to me. Arguably, Dead Space was the catalyst for this channel, but Resident Evil 4 was literally the catalyst for Dead Space. It's basically the same thing for me. Take as many times as I've played through Dead Space and double it, and that's how many times that I would just go through this game a year. The story, the giant escort mission, that wasn't really as horrible as you might always think, because you could just throw her in a dumpster, and the close quarters combat that somehow always resulted in Leon's neck and spinal cord getting some fresh air. This game is just an absolute masterpiece. As I began covering the Gigantes, remember when I called them Gigantes? It made like a lot of people salty. I know they're Gigantes. Anyways, I would then go on to cover the Regenerators before I realized a remaster was going to drop, which I did not see coming at all. Both of those will actually get a remaster, much like with my Dead Space breakdowns, with more biological information and better visuals. But this is why I did like a full stop on Resident Evil 4 as I waited for the remaster to finally come out. And as I say this, it looks like I've already got around 50 gigabytes out of the 67 downloaded, so I think it's time we get back into the world of unsteady breathing, stabby tails descending through the roof skewering you, the edgelord Salazar, who I called actually a sorority girl all 4 years of knowing her at every party I saw her at, Salazar, until one time she finally asked me what I meant and I explained it to her. I don't think she got it, but oh well. Let's continue on with this glorious infection of a game, the Resident Evil 4 Remake. But before getting into that, as always, thank you guys for watching this channel and supporting this content. I've been doubling up on videos recently between Roanoke Tales and Roanoke Gaming, so it's been a little tiring, but with all the engagements you guys are giving it, it does make it worth it, so thank you, but let's get to it. So, as a microbiologist, I have several interests, but typically my main focus is the discussion of the pathophysiology of a disease. While the disease itself is horrible, and I'm actually a bit of a hypochondriac, I'm a firm believer to know your enemy. The way a disease presents itself, how the body successfully fights back or fails to do so, what may be destroyed in the process of engaging in this micro-war, and ultimately, what is the outcome are things that are highly interesting as it shows a finely tuned process that has been cultivated through time, with those who deviated outside the lines having either met their end or potentially, if lucky enough, finding that they stood while others with a more standard reaction fell. You never know what you're going to get when it comes to your genetics and dealing with foreign bodies. Bacterial diseases are of particular interest to me, and what I am the most experienced in concerning lab background, with education branching into virology as well. However, there is one type of infection that I have always found to be the most mentally interesting and horrifying. Since I was a kid and first heard about the fact that you could get an amoeba up your nose that would then go on to eat your brain, I knew this planet was truly cursed. A living cell entering another cluster of living cells and wreaking havoc in a way that results in the end of that host. Can you think of anything more panic-inducing? And not only that, in some ways these animals can end up controlling the host as well. It will quite literally engineer their end in just the way they want. These are known as parasites. Their only goal, much like all of life on this planet, is survival. However, instead of being a prokaryote and trying to divide and use up resources, we, have antibiotics or your immune system that can handle those, or a virus that your body has specifically adapted to that will then tell cells that are producing said virus to pop and control the infection. Parasites are unlike these two things and are exceedingly difficult to get rid of, which I'm required by myself to tell you concerning bacteria specifically. We're also on the verge of no longer being able to treat gonorrhea, as it's becoming antibiotic resistant to our stronger antibiotics, so remember that. And for the love of God, stop flushing your antibiotics down the drains and just finish your course of them to make sure the bacteria for your infection is destroyed, unless you want to create a stronger version of that bacteria. Off topic, I know, but information is power, baby. Okay, so, where were we? Yes, parasites. So parasites are a different animal entirely. See, the human body is only okay at dealing with and destroying these parasites. In some ways, we can clear the infection quickly and without issue, but in most ways, this is not the case, and there are several reasons for this. When you are infected with a parasite, clearing it is in no way assured. In fact, there are many people who have malaria for the rest of their lives because they do not have access to treatments. These adaptations to this parasite are also equally interesting from a human perspective. There is something known as sickle cell, and it is a genetic mutation that arose from the presence of malaria because those that actually had the genetics that will create sickle cell would be able to deal with the infection much more effectively. Typically associated with those who have family ties to Africa, this causes the red blood cell to actually change its skeletal, or at least bolster its skeletal shape into that of like a sickle if it has 2 copies of the genetic coding as opposed to 1. So in those people who have the circular shape that we typically associate with RBCs will have 1 copy, whereas if you have the 2 copies, it will be sickle cell. And this is because malaria is endemic to this region, and those that possessed this trait would have an essential part of their cell resistant, but not likely in the way that you think. Actin within red blood cells is what gives the cell its shape. When infected by the malaria parasite, those that have sickle cell would be resistant to the changes that the parasite would try to impose on the red blood cell. Those who do not have the sickle cell trait will then have their red blood cells basically become altered and become sticky and attached to blood vessel walls, which causes inflammation. Because the parasite cannot change the actin structure in those who have the sickle cell trait, it decreases the symptoms of the parasitic infection, thus making this an advantageous trait. Now, the issue arises when both parents have the sickle cell trait and they pass it along like those gene copies and they both code for it. Having one gene from, say, like your mother who has normal hemoglobin structure genes, and then from your father who has this perfectly viable condition that establishes you as more resistant to malaria, I mean, everything's good. But with both genes coding for the sickle cell, this leads to many issues like anemia, blood vessel destruction through blood clots, strokes, heart attacks, and everything that comes with it because of how the cells themselves are shaped. They'll basically latch onto each other and create these clots. So you're probably wondering to yourself, what does this have to do with Resident Evil 4? People who have been here longer know that this is basically just a science channel in a trench coat selling you video game breakdowns and then trying to make you learn the Chad science of biology. Wrapping up the malaria connection, the point is, parasites can inspire changes in your body, which can result in things that are good in some aspects, but outside of that specific scenario, it can actually be quite detrimental to your survival. Enter the Las Plagas. This parasitic disease not only takes over the host of the body completely, and in some ways destroys it to protect itself from attack, but will influence and alter the actions of the person to a degree that will have you wonder if they are actually still in there or not. So let's start from the beginning on this parasite, and then move into why the body cannot just simply rid itself of the Las Plagas on the immunological front, and then get into how it is able to accomplish what it actually does to the human body concerning domination and mutations. So nice to be back into Resident Evil 4. So, to start with a little bit of history for those that are not familiar with the parasite or where it comes from, the idea initially, since you are in the mountains of Spain, is that, it must be endemic to this location, given that, well, it's here, and it appears to have been trapped here for quite some time. But this isn't necessarily true. The Las Plagas parasite, also known as the Plagues, actually appears to be a species that may have its evolutionary history based in West Africa. Okay, likely to brutalize this name, but within the Dopaya Kingdom, there were some ruins that the organism was located in. They believe that it actually dated back to the Neolithic age, where in layman's terms means around 4300 BC to 2000 BC. But clearly, for this species to evolve, it was always in this area. Humanity just happened across it at this point. It appears that it may have jumped continents around the Bronze Age and ended up in Spain during this time frame. Now, anyone who knows about the Bronze Age, it's sort of an odd time because everything appears to have just been coming up Millhouse for humanity as we continued working and thriving, but then all at once, the age collapsed, and we to this day don't really 100% know what happened. There just doesn't appear to be a lot of leftover evidence. One hypothesis that is raised is that there was a massive flood around this time, which is why nobody could just sit around and write about what was happening, as a lot of people were wiped out all at once. Because you gotta remember, around then, all the big trading ports were just that. They were ports. They would be around water. Anybody who wasn't around there likely was not really that involved in the bronze trade and wasn't as a developed area. So what appears to have maybe happened is that, again, there's, like, in every culture, there appears to be a story of, like, great flood around this time frame, biblical or not. It appears that there may be some truth to it. And this is because they think that possibly, I think it was either the Black Sea or the Mediterranean, I can't remember specifically which, but they think an asteroid or basically a meteorite or something may have impacted it, basically wiping out all the civilizations around in this area. But we as a species just have large portions of our history wiped out by catastrophe, which is pretty normal. They say back in the day, there were around 2,000 humans left, and we were confined to the coast of Africa because there was a big issue, I believe it was with energy reaching the planet, so there was a mass die-off. Hopefully, we don't end up doing that to ourselves with nukes, but you just never know. The world's getting a little crazy out there. Anyhow, as the Bronze Age collapsed, the parasite would remain within Spain for some time as society would then rebuild back to a degree. The Spaniards in this area that housed the Las Plagas would find themselves also being infected by the parasite, and then a pushback like thousands of years later would begin. A man by the name of Salazar would launch a campaign against those who were intentionally being infected with the parasite known as the ganados. The ganados held the parasites, or the parasite in general, in high regard as they performed sacrifices to it. This crusade would ultimately be successful as the Plagas would be driven underground inside of the caves of the mountains and then sealed away. Understanding the danger this parasite posed to his people, where the parasite was sealed, a fortress would then be built on top of it to keep all curious individuals away. Salazar would then pass the title to his offspring to maintain the fortress and continue to keep this parasite secure underground. However, things would not go well roughly 1,000 years in the future. I mean, imagine someone caring about what you care about right now 1,000 years in the future. It's not likely. We'll probably be back to hunting with spears if Einstein was right about us fighting World War IV with rocks and spears. Anyways, a man by the name of Osmond Sadler, which, by the way, I do have to say we're kind of getting into some spoilers at this point, but at the end of the day, this is a remake and the game has been out for 18 years. Do you feel old yet? Because I do. Moving on, Sadler would come into contact with Ramon Salazar and essentially convince him his family was wrong for imprisoning the Las Plagas. Sadler would offer Salazar a high position in the cult if he would help him release the parasite to form the Los Illuminados, or the Enlightened Ones. So Salazar, being the punk that he is, would agree, as the digging would then continue for the Las Plagas, and this would basically kind of dishearten everybody. At first, it appeared that the parasite was donezo. As they went into the caves and began looking for it, they would find body after body of the parasite, but not any living. That was until villagers began to exhibit strange symptoms. It became clear that while the oxygen-starved caves didn't keep the adult Las Plagas alive, they had entered a spore form of their life cycle that did not require the same constraints that allowed them to enter the lungs of the villagers after that and begin the infection process. This would make Sadler exceedingly happy, as this meant now the rest of the tests could begin. Building a military complex on top of some ancient ruins on a nearby island, they would begin studying the plaga, because if you didn't know your enemy, it could get out of hand. Quite the concept. Maybe we should apply that in life. But through the studies of this parasite, they learned several things about them. To start, the parasite itself is an arthropod, which means it's an incredibly old species. The species of parasite has likely been infecting animals that are in West Africa with surprising regularity, but because they are just typical animals, the main outcome would just be a potentially higher aggression level, which is difficult to determine in a species unless outward presentation of symptoms indicate why it is actually being more aggressive, but therein lies the nefariousness of the Las Plagas, as they do not force outward symptoms to appear during the day, unless it's like, again, another form of mutation. But by then, you likely already know that something is wrong with this animal. Like with the dogs, for instance, we definitely see something is wrong with them. But this is also the issue with humans being infected. Aggression will rise under certain situations, but while interacting day to day, they do not appear as if anything is wrong. The Las Plagas present in a few different ways. As Sadler continued his work and the study at the military complex island, it became apparent that there were a few strands that I guess you could say were, their own little lineages. One strand may have a queen, and the rest down line from her would be subservient to her influence. Utilizing this means once an infected person was infected, they too would become subservient to those that are upstream to them, as Sadler and Salazar would find themselves higher at the top. However, other individuals would also be dominant, making their own lines. If one ganado was infected with another dominant individual of Las Plagas, they would form their own line and may serve as an interference to Sadler's line. Because of this realization, not everyone was infected with Las Plagas, and only a few were chosen specifically to receive them. Salazar and Mendez, the priest, were infected, to which Mendez would then go on to infect others through his church, where again he was a priest. With the local population subdued, they served as a lookout to report to Salazar and ultimately Sadler, keeping an eye on the local law enforcement and foreign agents. As this issue continued to grow, eventually it would catch the eye of the United States government. USA, baby! More so after a man named Krauser got involved with the Los Illuminados. Krauser, belonging to the Hive or Host Capture Force, or just HCF for short, was dispatched to the area to determine what was going on with a man by the name of Louis Serra being completely separate. Krauser was basically trying to prove that he was loyal to Sadler so that he could conduct his mission and research, who would then go on to abduct Ashley Graham, or the president's daughter, in order to get closer. However, Sadler was not really an idiot and knew that this Krauser guy was up to something from the beginning, because it's literally said in the game that he's American and that he wouldn't trust him. Anyway, so Krauser was then infected with a dominant form of Plaga, which is interesting why they wouldn't want him controlled, but this may have been more of a mistake and Sadler didn't know that there were dominant forms yet. After this, he became the turd in the punch bowl for all sides, as Ada Wong was then sent out to continue the investigation by the rival company, which is a rival to Umbrella. What a name. While this was happening, obviously the president would be rather upset about his daughter getting captured, so the absolute unit known as Leon Kennedy would then be dispatched to rescue her, getting caught in the crossfire between the Los Illuminados, the rival company, and Krauser just absolutely losing it and taking you out 40 times in a row to even survive the encounter with him due to quick time events that give you 4 milliseconds to complete. Like, it wasn't enough. All I could say is if you had a few beers, when you get to this part of the game, just put the controller down and go do something else. You will not have the reaction time to complete this fight. But this brings up where we are now, which is now like everybody's favorite portion, at least it's my favorite portion because this is why I made this channel, the actual pathophysiology of the Lost Plagas. So the actual Lost Plagas, as we have discussed a little bit already, but just as a refresher, since, we've gotten further along in the video, like 16 minutes, it's an arthropod that is capable of infecting animals and controlling them in a much more hands-on way. Assumedly, this species hails from West Africa and came into being a long time ago. After making its way over to Spain during the Bronze Age through the trade brought on by humanity's, time frame here, a local group would assumedly begin worshipping the parasite in some capacity, though they didn't know it was just a literal animal that they were giving themselves over to. Which you have to ask yourself, why would an animal be worth worshipping? I mean, a parasite, because I'm aware, some animals are considered sacred in some cultures out there, but this one just seems rather odd. So once this parasite began spreading through the pagan worshippers, they were eventually subdued by Salazar and his family, and then they were put in charge of stopping the escape of this creature out into the world. That was until the 8th generation led to this absolute nerd known as Ramon, which, my god, if you thought he was creepy looking in the original, look how they massacred my boy in the remake. In a good way, though, because something about the white eyelashes is just massively disturbing. God! Horrific reveals that basically just show European royalty that my freedom brain refuses to acknowledge aside, the parasite would be desiccated and devoid of life, but some had entered the spore stage in order to survive in the harsh environments, which we actually see in life forms from time to time. Bacteria, for instance, has a spore stage that when the environment has become exceedingly difficult to survive in and it's not assured, entering this stage, the spore can last where we thought maybe only 10,000 years or so, but nature likes to prank humanity, so the oldest one that we were actually able to revive is about 25 to 30 million years old. These spores can also withstand more than just time. Once entering the spore stage, their metabolism stops. I mean, it's completely they're just a packet of genetic material at this point that then can be carried into the stratosphere before raining back down on the other side of the planet. Now, a single-cell organism is different from a multicellular one, such as with the Lost Plagas, but regardless, the spore stage appears to be quite sustainable for existing in environments your more active form cannot. Also, what's interesting about bacteria is the endospore stage, they're just, again, fundamentally packets of genetic information that allows for the bacteria to wake back up and begin dividing. Sort of reminds me of a virus somewhat, being just another packet of information that doesn't really appear to be alive or dead, because we actually still aren't 100% sure where viruses originally come from as of now. Everything else makes sense except for them. There's gonna be someone that's like, actually, it's been proven. No, it hasn't. It has not been proven where viruses come from yet. We're close to figuring it out and putting that final nail in the coffin, but we still, without any doubt, can say where they've come from. My money, depending how weird they are, whether originating here or somewhere else, is kind of irrelevant, but it would be interesting if they did come from, not Earth. Anyways, moving on. The Lost Plagas infection process, once entering the spore stage, allowed it to enter through the lungs where it would burrow through the lung tissue, which may cause you to cough up blood. For Leon and Ashley, however, this was not the reason that they are expelling blood. This has more to do with the attachment site than anything, and it does appear, though, that there is some lung damage based on where it is. Once moving through the lungs, on the gonados specifically, when they were infected, it would then be in the thoracic cavity where it would attach to the spinal cord of the person right next to the heart. Seemingly drawn to the nervous system of the host, this would allow it to also control the host's actions physically, but alter them mentally during these controlled events and subsequent host-controlled events as well, like a subtle influence while the host was back in the driver's seat. However, this would require the growth of the parasite to actually begin exhibiting these symptoms. The first portion of the infection hour involves the aforementioned attachment and then the integration into the spinal cord, but more as a mass on the side of it. This is intensely painful for the host and can make them pass out during the process, as when Leon passes out after his fight with the lake monster. This would be the moment the parasite went from the larval form, and the egg, I suppose the best way to put it, to the adolescent form. Once this happens, your immune system would begin going haywire, but therein lies the issue for your body as to why you cannot just clear this infection. So, let's get into some immunological functions, because that's what some of us are here for, and then we can move back into the infection process. You, right there, listening, as an animal, suck at getting rid of parasites. We sort of touched on this earlier with malaria, and without treatment, well, you're kind of screwed, my friend. But because of our big brainy brains, we have begun to basically pick up the slack where our bodies fail. But it's not necessarily our body's fault either. Parasites are difficult things to get rid of, in general, because it's an entire animal in most cases, and it's difficult for your body to find, subdue, and destroy it. But that's not going to stop it from trying. The first advantage, though, a parasite has against your body is it can usually outrun your immune response. We have seen some types of worms that, when they start to get attacked by the immune system, they will simply move to another area, making your immune system have to try to find them once more. Another advantage is some parasites will actually start, like the process of getting attacked, they will just shed their outer lining as the immune system was attached and actively attacking that, and then they'll just continue on like nothing happened. And if they start getting attacked again, they just shed that lining too. Others are just outright too large and have too thick of coatings on their body to effectively dissolve through before the parasite knows it's under attack and then runs away. And even still others are actually just, it sucks, but they're useful in some ways by what they do, which also helps them survive in our bodies. Now, a lot of you probably remember this fact that I've told you, but for all new people, parasites may yet play an important role in the regulation of your body. Have you ever wondered why first world countries have so many people with so many lethal allergies? Well, a reason might be we just do not have any parasites. Parasites, at least some, are known to actually calm the immune system activity by existing within hosts. They release a chemical that will lead to a calmer immune system at large, which means they will stop attacking them, but can also lead to the body to stop attacking itself in an autoimmune fashion. The thinking is because whenever the first world person gets a parasite, we obviously want to get rid of it. Over time, this can lead to worsening allergies as the immune system gets more aggressive towards invaders, and what it sees as an invader, this can kind of lead to like harm to the host itself. So with this in mind, if we ever want to colonize another planet or just get off this rock in general, we're going to need to figure out how to replace the effects of parasites and how they have on our bodies so that we just don't bring a bunch of parasites to space with us and have to infect ourselves intentionally. We're going to have to find a medication that is going... I mean, honestly, gene therapy is really what's going to do it. CRISPR is the way forward. For every other thing on this planet, no free rides. You know, we've had to contend with parasites as a species since the dawn of our species, so we've kind of adapted to it. But anyhow, this functionality and coexisting is unsurprisingly beneficial for both and necessary because, again, let's be real here, as much as you hate the idea of another animal getting a free ride by eating you and surviving, it's not like it's something we could really avoid in any major capacity. Parasites are just everywhere, but there are those that serve no benefit to humanity and are just through and through freeloading 30-day-old parasites living in their host's basement. These ones completely suck, and as a result, your body does have ways of dealing with these, although not always effectively. Also, if you want to know something interesting, mosquitoes have no purpose. We could actually develop, and we are developing, a way to get rid of mosquitoes that then would get rid of a bunch of parasites because the parasites are dead-end species and there's nothing that they do that helps the ecosystem. So, hey, maybe one day there won't be any actual mosquitoes left on Earth, which would be amazing. But then again, what happens to the mosquito eaters? I guess they'll eat other bugs. It doesn't really matter. But when a parasite enters your body, your immune system becomes aware of it fairly quickly due to the fact that on its surface, it's not presenting markers that designate it as self. When this happens, the body begins reacting pretty quickly, which triggers an immunoglobulin E response, which utilizes antibodies and is just a more complicated term for an allergic response. Inflammation, itching, increasing blood flow to the site, all the classics. IgE will then bond to Fc receptors on leukocytes such as eosinophils, basophils, and mast cells. The big one we will talk about is eosinophils, but they all play their part in degranulation and cytokine release. So let's start with the humble mast cells, shall we? The mast cells play an important role in things like intestinal parasites and worms that, get into your intestines. Mast cells release proteases that are found to be severely toxic to certain types of parasites, rendering them essentially poisoned and disabled by breaking down proteins and polypeptides from that parasite. At that point, the mast cells will then induce what is known as hyperplasia. This is basically an increase in mucus secretion that the disabled parasites are then caught up in, and then it's forced out of your body, leading to a decrease in overall parasitic infection. The basophils have another method of cutting down the numbers of invaders in your system by working with other immune cells. Once antigen stimulation has happened, basophils will secrete what is known as IL-4 to get macrophages on site. Proteases are then secreted as well, which again does basically what it needs to, but it will also recruit monocytes, neutrophils, and eosinophils to the infection site to begin the process of cleanup. Basophils' job essentially is to kick off the process of type 2 immunity. But hold on, what is type 2 immunity? Well, let's start that question off by answering what is type 1 immunity. Type 1 immunity is essentially the defense against intracellular pathogens like bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms, whereas type 2 promotes the immunity against extracellular parasites and helminths, and also maintains homeostasis and regulates tissue repair following an injury. It's basically all part of the same process, but different phases. You can kind of think of it like that. And type 3 immunity is when cytokines get released and is particularly effective at controlling infections caused by specific bacteria. And now we get to the absolute chad of an immune cell when it comes to the immune response, the eosinophils. It's sort of like that friend in a bar fight that punches themselves in the face to get amped up before going after the actual problem. Eosinophils play the role of moving to the area and destroying whatever is flagged for destruction. While they can undergo phagocytosis, which basically means to engulf, they are more effective at releasing an extremely potent mediator that cuts open the parasite, spilling its contents into the surrounding area. Essentially, eosinophils will eviscerate parasites. It's pretty metal. However, these same mediators can also damage the surrounding tissue in some respects, hence the punching yourself in the face. This specific immune cell is also responsible for destroying allergens that get into the body, as well as they can take on cancer cells that aren't listening to undergo apoptosis. They will remind the cancer cell that it wasn't asking for it to destroy itself, it was telling it to. Gotta love eosinophils. But again, the downside there is that sometimes collateral damage is associated with the cell's activation, but you should see how many of your cells end up just getting bodied after you have a fever. It's literally millions. So, all of these come together to give you a form of immunity against parasites, but the issue is, even with all of this, it's still not 100% guaranteed that you will clear the infection. It may take the outside intervention of basically humanity in a lot of ways to get the job done. It should be noted that there are a ton of immunological cells involved in this process to deal with parasites, but at some point, we got to get back to the actual Las Plagas. So this is a very just basic way of explaining it, which let's do that right now because it shows why the infection is impossible for your body to clear. As the Las Plagas egg hatches and moves to the spinal cord, this presents an interesting challenge to your body that it will not overcome, unfortunately. The immune system is supposed to be terrified of the nervous system. Some may even say nervous of it.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Well, I guess that's like a step down from terrified, but anything for a pun. The reason for this is because if the immune system treated the nervous system infection like it treats other areas in the body that are infected, this would lead to damage to the host in a way that you may not recover from, that could result in your end because it makes you less viable for your environment, thus ruining your chances of reproduction if you haven't reproduced yet, and that's just not going to be helpful for anybody. So, because of this immune response and the immune privileged sites, such as the brain, spinal cord, eyes, and to a degree the gonads, also your fat is immune privileged, because there's just not a lot of blood flow to it. Infections may be allowed to persist in these areas because the immune system cannot hit with everything it has. In fact, the brain-eating amoeba, Naegleria fowleri, which I have a hyperfixation on whenever I go to the lake where it lives, is one of those things that the immune system just cannot get a grasp on because it's essentially wearing boxing gloves to a knife fight. Also, two things before moving on. Autoimmune issues can have the immune system attack the nervous system. That's absolutely possible. We see it all the time. It's horrible. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to fix that. But Naegleria fowleri also gets up your nose when you jump into lake water with the sediment at the bottom having been disturbed. So plug your nose before jumping into any natural body of water, and also maybe even pools, because you need to have them essentially chlorinated so that it can destroy amoebas like that, or if it's a saltwater pool, the salt has to be at the correct levels. So just heads up on that. Anyhow, when the amoeba enters the nose, it follows up to the exposed nervous tissue high up into the nose, drawn in by the communication of those cells. Once entering this area, neutrophils would be dispatched, but too many of the amoebas will make it through, where they will start eating neuronal tissue of the brain. This causes your immune system to completely freak out as the meninges then swell, putting pressure on the brain, causing brain damage and ultimately death, unfortunately. One person I think to date has been spared this fate due to the timing that they got to the hospital and a ton of medications, one of those being experimental, but most arrive way too late. Actually, everybody except that one person have arrived too late. If you get a stiff neck after you go to the lake, immediately go to the hospital. But the reason the amoeba cannot be effectively cleared is because the immune system's effectiveness near the nervous system, whether that be central or peripheral, is just completely downgraded. And this is exactly what the Las Plagas is banking on. Being that it is attached to your nervous system, the immune response to it would be extremely limited, which it's then able to hold at bay rather easily, as it's larger than normal as well. Then it continues to grow, and this will be incredibly painful for the host, given the pressure that it is putting on the spinal cord, as well as the integration process into the spinal cord that likely isn't all that wonderful either. This will result in inflammation responses all over the body, as the immune system sends out chemical messengers, which leads to blood vessel inflammation, most notably in the eyes, then convulsions and hallucinations. For younger individuals, this infection process is usually lethal, which is why you see no younglings in the village itself. Adults seem to be the only one who can survive the infection process, if you can call it that, but as soon as the Plagas breaks out of its egg and begins altering the host in some pretty significant ways, it's basically over for them anyways. Eventually, as the Plagas continues to grow, it will be able to exit the body after the head has become a lost cause, and this is known as Plaga A, B, and C. Plaga A is a standard tentacle variant that will come out at night and has a large scythe that it will use to lash out at any individual that is not infected. This scythe is razor sharp and made of bone, and if it connects with the fragile bones in another human's neck, it can easily result in their head rolling off of their shoulders with very little effort. This variant shows us that it's likely coiled around the spinal column of the person infected with the standard version of Plaga. It may also indicate timing, as this version seems less developed than the other two, which comes down to how long it's been altering and adapting host tissue for its use. Plaga B are, in my complete opinion, the most horrifying. Coming out like a worm, they possess a large singular mouth in the middle of its body. Arm-like extremities flank either side of it, where it grabs onto you, and then it can see what your head tastes like, but I also break away for a moment to tell you that your fingers are just little arms at the end of your arms. The top knuckle is the shoulder, the middle knuckle is the elbow, and the bottom knuckle is your wrist. You're welcome for that. This version of Plaga appears to be the most developed in terms of volume, and appears to require the most host tissue to form itself, being several feet in length. However, I would say it spent the second most amount of time in the body because it's not able to detach itself fully from the host, meaning it is still not viable on its own as an individual. The last Plaga, Plaga C, is the most hated because it uses the most ammo. After it exits from a person's neck, if the body becomes a lost cause to it, it will then detach from the spinal cord entirely and run away and attack a few more times, trying to subdue its attacker. Seeing that it is fully formed and able to move on its own, this appears to be a form of Plaga that is meant to lay eggs somewhere and continue on the line, as it no longer is required to remain within the host to be able to survive. Its body is lithe and built like a spider, making it worse as its legs have become long and spindly. Prior to the evacuation of humans to these creatures, however, the changes to the body will exist to further the parasite's ability to survive. See, it has nothing to do with saving the human body. You're basically just a meat taxi that it then adds armor plating to by making you not feel things. Why would you ever think that's the way forward? Those infected can be hit with lead several times, stabbed, and also just hit really hard in general and will still remain functional, likely because the parasite itself is blocking pain signals by reaching the brain early on. On top of this, considering it's made out of tentacles, it may also bolster broken bones by then holding them together. So as a result of this interference, the Plagas will also increase the strength of humans by amplifying the signals to the muscles to attack and then remove the brain block, which then tones down natural human strength. Because again, the human body is just a host, and the parasite likely has no intention of staying permanently, so why protect the host in any measure? Exactly, you wouldn't. The body's totally expendable. The Plagas itself are also interesting because they behave sort of like a colony of ants would concerning hierarchy. There are different lines in dominant Plaga that will result in different lines, but we also see that with ants when a new queen is born. She will leave the colony and then go form another line somewhere else. This social ability is rather interesting. I'm not really sure if I want to call it eusocial because they don't appear to take care of any brood collectively, it seems. I mean, it's maybe they do, but also humans are a main portion of infecting others. I mean, naturally they would be infecting others. I just don't know if they're really taking care of each other, so it's not exactly eusocial. But, I mean, humans do influence the parasites as well. So this leads to different lines that may not want to cooperate either. Mendez regards how they share the same blood, but he will end Leon if necessary regardless of the Plagas infection, meaning that the parasite in Mendez won't hesitate to destroy the parasite in Leon. And this is also seen when El Gigante, remember what I called it years ago? Again, oh my god. Anyways, it will literally crush other infected hosts before going after Leon. It's not the mind of El Gigante, it's the line of parasite. Regardless, the queen disperses the eggs, and the eggs get into the human form, but supposedly even controlling them like meat mechs, the human is still in there for a time, but will be changed as time progresses. The parasites do have a form of communication, which is integral to showing the devolving of the human control over the body. When confronted by a Leon, they will form a pack mentality, which may be full parasite, but it's also still a very human trait. They communicate specifically by ultra-high frequency sound waves, where if there's no dominant plaga giving the order, they will just group up and deal with the issue. They are able to communicate by specialized organs inside of their body that is able to penetrate the human tissue and then get to them. But higher up the chain, the dominant individual can also send out commands to do specific tasks using this frequency, which the subordinate plaga will then comply, and whether that be attack a house or come to church when the bell tolls. At this point, the human aspect is not completely, it's mostly gone, and the plaga have most of the control. Outside of the 100% taking over portion, the person is still there, but their perception and mind will be warped over time, and this is actually seen when Leon sees a pot of rotting meat later on in his infection process and remarks how he could go for a steak. The Plagas is starting to reach his mind at this point and alter how he thinks through chemical communication. This process in the later stages will result in the brain being somewhat functional, but now is basically just puppeted by the Plagas, which I would have to assume at this point brain damage has also begun mounting, so they are easily controlled. Also, another thing that will happen once the Plagas enter the body is the eyes will begin turning red, which seems to suggest maybe there's a type of bioluminescence that is released by the parasite as it continues to infect the body, though this is still unknown. So, to wrap this thing up, there is one major flaw of the parasite which is shown early on with Leon, but he would be unsure of how to interpret that. At night, the parasite can then exit the body of its own free will by destroying the head and assumingly possibly reforming in the morning, because we know the parasite can induce mutations like it did with Mendez, but we don't know if they go back to their original form. Although it is suggested when Lady Dimitrescu changed one time before, she was able to go back into her original form, although this is not the Las Plagas, and that is something else entirely. It just seems like maybe people can go back to their original form. Anyways, having your head destroyed every night. What a life. So UV radiation will absolutely body a Plagas, which in turn would suggest that they may have come from the caves themselves and are a troglodytic species existing within the dark zone of caves, never being exposed to light. As a result, they never adapted to the radiation, which in turn can lead them to be burned away if they are exposed to it. This is advantageous as there's no way to remove the Las Plagas from the host without paralysis of the host or their complete end. By using UV light within the body, this can destroy the parasite, letting your body break down the carcass over time without damaging your nervous system, although it's probably going to give your lungs and heart a sunburn. There are medications that can slow down the growth of the parasite and give you more time to clear the infection by a medical procedure, but this isn't a cure, it's just time measure. However, if the eggs are unhatched and the medication is administered, this can stop it entirely and then take out the eggs. This suggests the parasite hatches and grows, and because it's literally altering your biochemistry, it would then be using your tissue to protect itself and make sure that the medication does not reach, at least in any lethal amount that could take it out. The Las Plagas is a form of parasite that can reach into your head, likely with its tentacles, and begin altering the very way you think about the world around you. As the infection process would continue, this would ultimately result in your end, as your body would not be able to counter the parasite due to the size of the creature and the location of the attachment point. Anyone who thinks that this would be a great thing for humanity in general is definitely a huge nerd and probably named Sadler. I think this guy must have already been infected or something from the drop, because there's literally zero power to be gained here.